Ever feel like you're just bombarded with news and it's hard to figure out what really matters?
Yeah, totally. It's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes.
Exactly. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to really zero in on the recent actions and statements of U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, especially what he's been saying about how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world.
It's a fascinating time to be looking at this, you know? I mean, he's really pushing for a different approach than what we've seen in the past, especially when you look at how he thinks the U.S. should be using its power and influence.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really stood out to me was his trip down to Panama. He seemed pretty concerned about the Panama Canal, specifically with China being more involved there.
Right. And it makes sense when you consider how strategically important that canal is. I mean, think about it. It's a major artery for global trade. And the U.S. has a long history of involvement there, both for security and for keeping things running smoothly.
He even suggested that Panama might be breaking the treaty by letting China have so much control.
That's a bold statement. He's basically implying that the U.S. might have to step in and protect its interests.
Wow. Okay, so then he made some pretty strong comments about USI, the U.S. Agency for International Development. He seemed to think that they're operating more like a global charity than an organization that's putting U.S. interests first.
Yeah, he actually used the phrase rank insubordination. Pretty strong words coming from a Secretary of State.
Definitely. But it sounds like he's trying to fundamentally change how foreign aid works. He wants to make sure it's directly supporting U.S. foreign policy goals, not just going wherever it's needed most.
Right. He actually paused all foreign aid for a while so his team could evaluate every single program. But then he issued waivers for certain ones.
Like those counter-migrant flights from Panama and El Salvador, right?
Exactly. So it seems like he's using foreign aid as leverage to get countries to cooperate on specific issues.
So it's more of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of approach.
That's one way to put it. It's definitely a much more transactional approach to foreign aid than we've seen before. And it's really interesting to see how he's trying to connect that to other areas like trade.
Yeah, he has some strong opinions about trade deals with Canada and Mexico. He seems to feel that the U.S. has been getting the short end of the stick in the past.
Definitely. He's arguing for reciprocity, meaning that if other countries want access to U.S. markets, they have to give U.S. companies the same access in their own countries. And he's not afraid to use tariffs as leverage to make that happen.
And he was pretty critical of Canada's protectionist policies and what he sees as their lack of cooperation on the fentanyl issue.
Right. He sees that as a major problem. And he's made it clear that he's willing to take a tough stance to get what he sees as fair treatment for the U.S.
Now, let's talk about something that seemed to come out of nowhere, this cooperation between the U.S. and Venezuela. I mean, they haven't exactly been on friendly terms lately.
True, but it's important to remember that things are rarely black and white in international relations. Just because Maduro is cooperating on things like returning migrants and releasing those American prisoners doesn't mean he's suddenly changing all his policies.
And Rubio made a point of calling those Americans hostages instead of prisoners.
Yeah, that's a subtle but important distinction. It suggests that he still sees Maduro as an untrustworthy actor who's only willing to cooperate when it benefits him.
It's a really complicated situation, and it gets even more complex when you factor in the issues Rubio brought up about MS-13 gang members and other criminals being deported from the U.S. He seems pretty concerned about getting other countries to cooperate on taking them back.
It's definitely a top priority for him, especially since he's so focused on border security. And this is where his praise for El Salvador's president comes in.
Because of how successful he's been in fighting gang violence and crime, right?
Exactly. Rubio seems to be saying that he's willing to work with leaders who get results, even if they've been criticized by others. It's a very pragmatic approach.
So he's looking for partners who are willing to cooperate on the issues he cares about, regardless of their past. Makes sense. Now, what about Iran? He seems pretty convinced that they're in a vulnerable position right now.
He does. He pointed to the internal unrest and the fact that their alliances are strained. And he's calling for the U.S. to take advantage of that by increasing pressure on Iran and going back to a strategy of deterrence to stop their nuclear program and support for terrorism.
He specifically mentioned the Houthi rebels in Yemen who've been attacking ships around the world.
Yeah, he's claiming Iran is supplying them with weapons. It all ties back to this idea of establishing consequences for bad behavior and showing that the U.S. won't tolerate threats to its interests.
So let's talk about China now. I mean, Rubio's called the U.S.-China relationship the defining challenge of this century. And it sounds like he wants a pretty dramatic shift in how the U.S. approaches that relationship.
Oh, absolutely. He's very concerned about China's economic and military power, and he's pushing for the U.S. to decrease its dependence on China for essential things. Like he specifically mentioned energy, medicine, and minerals.
So it's about building up domestic production and finding new sources for these things, basically creating more options so the U.S. isn't so reliant on China.
Exactly. It's about reducing vulnerability and creating a more level playing field. And this is where his stance on Cuba comes in, too.
He's pretty adamant about not engaging with the current Cuban government.
He sees them as a threat because of their ties with China, Russia, and Iran. And he's not willing to budge on that unless they make some major changes.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot here, from the Panama Canal to criticisms of USA Day, strong words on trade, and unwavering positions on Iran and Cuba. It seems Secretary Rubio is definitely taking a pretty assertive approach to international relations. What are your initial takeaways from all of this?
Well, the biggest thing that strikes me is how he's trying to redefine the traditional tools of diplomacy and foreign aid. It's all about making sure they directly benefit the US, getting tangible results and using them as leverage to get other countries to cooperate. It's a very practical and results-oriented approach.
And it sounds like it's shaking things up quite a bit.
Oh, without a doubt. He's challenging a lot of the assumptions about how the US should be operating in the world. Whether this approach will be effective in the long run, well, that's the million-dollar question.
It is. And we'll definitely dig into that more as we continue our deep dive. But for now, let's take a moment to digest everything we've learned so far.
What's interesting is it feels like this is something people are really responding to. Like there's this feeling in the US that we've been giving and giving on the world stage and not getting much back. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, definitely. People are tired of feeling like the U.S. is getting taken advantage of, whether it's in trade deals or with foreign aid.
Right, exactly. And Rubio's tapping into that frustration. It's like he's saying, we're not going to be pushovers anymore. We're going to put America's interests first.
And that means being willing to call out even our allies like Canada when he feels they're not treating the U.S. fairly.
And that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, will this more confrontational approach actually work? Will it make other countries more cooperative, or could it backfire and cause even more tension?
Yeah, it's a gamble for sure. But it seems like Rubio believes that showing strength, being willing to walk away from a deal is the best way to get good results for the U.S.
It's a high-stakes game, that's for sure. And we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about Cuba. It's a country that's been a thorn in the side of the U.S. for a long time, and Rubio's made it very clear that he's not going to change his stance on them anytime soon.
He's definitely not a fan of the Cuban regime.
No, not at all. He sees them as a repressive dictatorship, plain and simple. And he's also really worried about their growing ties with China and Russia.
Yeah, that seems to be a major concern for him. He sees it as a direct threat to U.S. national security.
And it all feeds into this bigger worry he has about the influence of authoritarian regimes around the world. He sees Cuba as a potential base for those regimes right in the U.S.'s backyard, and he's determined to prevent that.
I mean, he even said that the only reason he'd ever go to Havana is to discuss the regime's exit from power. That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah, it really shows how little faith he has in the current Cuban government. He basically believes that the only solution is for them to step down and allow for free and fair elections.
It's a tough stance, but it's one that resonates with a lot of Cuban Americans who've experienced the hardships of living under that regime firsthand.
It's a reminder that foreign policy isn't just about abstract ideas or geopolitical strategies. It has real-world consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And speaking of real-world consequences, we have to talk about China. Rubio's called the U.S.-China relationship the biggest challenge the U.S. will face in the 21st century, and he's not mincing words about it.
He's deeply concerned about China's growing economic and military power. He sees them as a rival, a strategic competitor that wants to replace the U.S. as the world's leading power.
And he's worried about a lot of things, like their trade practices, their military expansion, their human rights record. It's a pretty long list.
And he wants the U.S. to take a much tougher stance against China. Build up our military presence in the Pacific, work with our allies to push back against China's economic influence, and promote democracy and human rights as a counter to China's authoritarian model.
It sounds like he wants a pretty fundamental shift in the U.S.-China relationship. Less cooperation, more competition.
Yeah, that's the direction he's pushing in. And it reflects a broader shift in thinking among U.S. policymakers. More and more people are recognizing that China poses a serious challenge to the U.S. and that we need to take a more competitive approach to protect our interests.
Yeah. So it's not just about trying to get along anymore. It's about recognizing that China is a rival, and acting accordingly. Okay, so let's turn our attention to Ukraine now. It's a country that's become a real flashpoint in the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism.
And Rubio's been a staunch supporter of Ukraine since the very beginning of the conflict with Russia. He sees Ukraine as a frontline state in the fight for democracy and believes that the U.S. has a moral obligation to stand with them.
He's been pushing hard for more military and economic aid to Ukraine, and he wants to see tougher sanctions against Russia. He wants to make sure Russia pays a price for its aggression.
It's about sending a message that the U.S. won't tolerate bullies and will stand up for those who are fighting for their freedom. It's a very principled stance.
And it really shows how much importance Rubio places on supporting democracy around the world. He sees the conflict in Ukraine as part of a bigger fight between democracy and authoritarianism.
And it's a fight that he's determined to win. He's made it clear that he sees the U.S. as a champion for democracy and a force for good in the world.
But as we've seen, there are some potential downsides to this more assertive approach to foreign policy. Some people are worried that it could alienate allies or lead to unintended consequences, like escalating tensions and making the world less stable.
Those are valid concerns, no doubt. But Rubio seems confident that this is the right approach for the U.S. in the long run. He believes that projecting strength and being willing to confront our adversaries head-on is the best way to protect our interests and ensure our security.
So it's a balancing act, really, trying to find the right mix of assertiveness and diplomacy to achieve U.S. goals.
Exactly. And it's a challenge that Rubio will have to continue to navigate as he tries to shape U.S. foreign policy in this increasingly complex and competitive world.
It's wild how those three countries, Russia, China, and Ukraine, are like the cornerstones of his whole foreign policy outlook. I mean, they really show how much he wants to push back against authoritarianism and protect what he sees as America's interests everywhere.
You hit the nail on the head. When you look at those countries, you really see how Rubio sees the world, you know? He really thinks the U.S. needs to step up and take charge, be more assertive in shaping the way things work internationally.
Yeah, he's using all the tools in the toolbox, not just military strength, but economic pressure, strategic alliances, even promoting democracy as a way to influence other countries.
It's definitely different from just leading by example, which is what some past presidents have focused on. He's basically saying that the U.S. can't just sit back and react anymore. We have to actively shape events to protect our interests. It's definitely a more realistic approach, one that acknowledges that power dynamics matter and that the U.S. needs to be decisive to get what it wants.
Makes you wonder, is this the future of U.S. foreign policy? Like, are we going to see more of this kind of approach in the years to come?
Tough to say for sure, but it's definitely a trend to keep an eye on. Not just in the U.S., but globally. More and more leaders are taking this tougher, more assertive stance.
I guess it makes sense, right? I mean, the world's changing so fast, and the lines between working together and competing are getting blurrier all the time.
And the stakes are higher, too. We've got climate change, pandemics, new technologies that could change everything. It's a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, feels like we're entering a new era of great power competition. The U.S. needs to be ready to use everything it's got to defend its interests and what it stands for.
It's a tough time for sure, but it's also a chance for the U.S. to figure out its place in this new world order and maybe work with its allies to make things a little more peaceful and prosperous,
Well said. So we've spent a lot of time digging into Secretary Rubio's perspective. But what do you think? Will his approach actually work? Can he really navigate all these challenges and make things more secure for the U.S.?
These are the big questions. And honestly, we don't have all the answers. But this deep dive, it's given you the information and the background to start forming your own opinions.
It's given us a lot to think about. And I really hope this encourages everyone listening to keep digging into these issues, have those tough conversations about what the U.S.'s role should be in the world.
At the end of the day, it's those conversations that will determine the kind of future we build.
Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We are here to make things clear.